All right, good. Okay, so a couple of things about me. He did, you know, the introduction, but things that you need to know so that you can know whether or not to believe me about anything that I'm saying. I was the director of the Keystone Center Extended Care Unit. I was actually at Keystone for over a decade. So I was raised on the field of sex addiction. So we talk about it more now in terms of problematic sexual disorders, but you'll hear me fall into the phraseology of sex addiction. It's just how I was trained. It's what I was raised on. It doesn't mean I'm picking sex addiction over any of the other definitions. It's just the nomenclature that I was brought up on. I also was a consultant for a victim services center, so I have a very large trauma background. So a lot of the lens through which I filter our clients is through a trauma background. I am the president of SASH. It says president-elect. Sorry about that. I am now the president. And so we are a nonprofit organization for research, training, and education on problematic sexual behaviors. So we want to look at sexual behaviors in a large umbrella, not just one, whether it's sexual compulsivity, sex addiction, paraphilic disorders. We want to be able to look at all sexual health issues. So again, that kind of filters how I look at things. Most importantly for me, for you guys to know, is I don't have a filter. And I do try to rein in when I'm doing presentations. A lot of the content may be disturbing. And I will say words like masturbation at least 15 times throughout this presentation. You can probably start keeping track now. Last night was the first dinner I went to where I don't think I said it once, which my loved ones would be astonished. So it can be triggering, though, for folks. Please take care of yourselves. If you need to leave, I won't take it personally. If you want me to take it personally, at least give me some sign as you're walking out the door that you're fed up with me. And I'm here. I'm here afterwards if you guys need to talk, if you need to process, because sex it's a heavy topic, and we're going to be talking about some heavy things. All right, does that sound fair? All right, so hopefully I'm going to give you guys enough knowledge that you can understand when we're talking about problematic sexual behaviors, the different diagnoses folks use, how to assess for it, how to start treatment planning, and I think that's probably going to be what we get to today. All right? So what are we talking about? There's a lot of different definitions for what we call problematic sexual behaviors. The most common one that you will hear in the field is sex addiction. That was started by Patrick Carnes many, many years ago. If anybody knows Patrick Carnes, his name, he's kind of the grandfather of our field. Great-grandfather now, maybe, I don't know. Don't tell him I said that. So he started with the sex addiction. There's a group of folks who believe in the term sexual compulsivity. Making a comeback or making prevalence now is hypersexual disorder. That was the diagnosis that was proposed for the DSM. So a lot of folks in the research, you're going to see hypersexual disorder as what they're talking about. Out of control sexual behavior, impulse control disorder. We're not going to talk that much about impulse control disorder. It's kind of lost a lot of favor in the field. Interactive addiction disorder, which is multiple addictions. So co-occurring drug, alcohol, sex addiction. And paraphilic disorder. We're going to spend a lot of time on paraphilic disorders. It's a sore button for me when I see diagnoses for those because often they're misdiagnosed. So let's start with sex addiction. How many of you guys work in the chemical dependency field, substance use field? Perfect. So you basically know the criteria, right? Substance use criteria is the same as sex addiction criteria. So why we don't call it a sex use disorder, I have no idea. If you guys could start calling it that, get it popular when we do this again in the future. But essentially what you have is that sexual behaviors, and we're talking the range of sexual behaviors. This goes from compulsive masturbation, pornography use, paying for sex, anonymous sex, sex with drugs, child pornography, child sex abuse images. That's the range of behaviors. They're engaged in for a longer period of time than intended. And so what you'll hear guys talk about, and there are female sex addicts, but I do say, guys, most of my clients are men. I have one female client right now. So most of our clients you will see are men. These are guys who didn't intend to start watching pornography at 10 o'clock at night. When they start watching pornography at 10 o'clock at night, they say, okay, I'm going to watch until midnight. Midnight comes, midnight goes. Next thing you know, it's 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. They're edging, they're still waiting, and they're late for work the next day, those types of things. Guys who will say, you know, I'm just going to stop by the strip club on my way home from work. My wife isn't due home for another hour. I have time. The next thing you know, it's 9, 10 o'clock at night. Wife is calling, where are you at? Worst story is the wife actually shows up at the strip club to haul you out of there, which you will hear those stories. Those are always the fun stories. So really it's the same mentality of I'm only going to have one beer, right? I'm only going to do this for an hour. I'm only going to go to see I'm going to cruise around the neighborhood to see if there's anybody new out working. I'm not going to stop, right? Very frequently our clients have a desire to stop their behaviors. Very frequently. There's that thing in the back of their brain that says, I don't want to do this again. I feel shame. I feel awful. I've had to lie to my partner again. I've stolen from my business. They don't want to engage in this behavior, but they can't stop. That urge to act out. A lot of times it's the shame from the previous acting out anymore that creates the new desire to act out. Time is spent to engage in the activity or find a way to engage in the activity. This is, for sex addiction in particular, the actual moment of sexual acting out is a letdown. The buildup is a lot of times where the arousal is. And so planning. So I knew that I was coming to Farley, last year I think we planned this, right? So the planning for, oh geez, you know what, I'm going to be out of town. My partner thinks I'm on a business trip. I'm going to be in a hotel, right? I can start looking to see what are the local hot spots, what's on Craigslist in Williamsburg, Virginia, who's on Tinder right now, right? I can start to plan. Oh yes, there are apps for this, in case anybody hasn't gotten the memo. There are apps for this. Our lovely technology is fascinating, right? So I can start planning, and I get that heightened arousal as I'm starting to think about, well, gee, what can I get away with when I'm down in Williamsburg, right? I actually get here, I actually go act out. It's kind of like Christmas morning where you ripped open up all the presents and you were like, okay, now can we go to grandma's house? Like what's next, right? But that arousal template is really important for our clients. Important social, occupational, or recreational activities are given up. Very frequently, they become very isolative. They're not hanging out as much with their friends, with their family. They're not getting as much work done. They're not as productive. You'll have clients come in and tell you that they must be ADHD because they're not getting work done. No, it's because you're thinking about sex all day long, right? You're not going to be able to get work done if you're looking at pornography. Let's take away the pornography. Let's see how much your ADHD is actually there. They'll continue to use the behavior despite knowing that it's causing them either physical or psychological problems. Some of our clients come in and they look like they have major depressive disorder. Once they stop acting out and the shame starts to lift and they become honest with themselves, those depressive symptoms lift as well. We have not as high a rate of suicide, but we do have a fairly decent rate of suicide with this population because of the shame, particularly for those who are engaging in the more illegal behaviors that they end up on the front page of the newspaper. Physical problems, obviously STIs are a big issue in this community. Urinary tract infections are also a big issue in this community. Compulsive masturbation can cause urinary tract infections. Particularly if you work with, does anybody work with an older population? Somewhat? Yeah. If you have a guy who keeps showing up with urinary, or a lady who keeps showing up with urinary tract infections, you may want to do a screening for masturbation. How often are they masturbating? What? I'm not going to. No, I'm not going there. No. 82? Does that sound fair? Can we go with 82? All right. You know. All right. So continuing to use despite problems. Now, tolerance and withdrawal. These are the reasons why folks don't like us using the term sex addiction, because they believe that we don't actually have tolerance or withdrawal, nor can it be measured in sex addiction. Well, guess what? What do you guys know, the substance use folks? What do you know about tolerance and withdrawal? They're neither necessary nor sufficient to make a diagnosis, right? So, but the thing about tolerance, you will get clients who never change their sexual template for 50 years. Whether it's I watch straight heterosexual pornography every night for 3 hours, that's my thing, that's what I've done, and they never shift off of that. Most often, though, our clients end up increasing risk. They become desensitized to what they're currently viewing. They become desensitized to engaging in paying for sex with escorts on Craigslist. Then they start to cruise the neighborhoods. They become more and more dangerous in their behaviors. we could think of that as tolerance. Withdrawal is interesting because the two studies that were done on withdrawal, one was at Keystone and one was in another residential facility. The symptoms of withdrawal are also very similar to what happens when you make men live in a house together for 6 weeks, right? They're cranky, they're irritable, they're nauseous, they're depressed, because I'm making them sit in group for 6 hours a day. Who wouldn't be crabby about that? But we do believe, you hear this from outpatient clients as well, that they do become more irritable, they become more tearful, there's more nocturnal emissions, which is natural. They become nauseous. Physically very fatigued. You'll find that they don't feel like they have as much energy as they're going through withdrawal. So we do believe that there's withdrawal for this. Just as a fun fact, ASAM does now include sex as an addiction. So you can feel a little bit more comfortable saying the word sex addiction if you were previously hesitant. Sexual compulsivity. So sexual compulsivity models itself off of obsessive compulsive disorder, right? So it's engaging in a behavior to still your brain, essentially, right? However, folks don't like us using the OCD diagnosis or the sexual compulsivity diagnosis because what can't compulsions be in an OCD diagnosis? Anybody know? Think about washing your hands, checking the door. Pleasurable. So it specifically says in the OCD diagnosis that the compulsion may not be pleasurable and therefore sex may not count. The DSM has actually ruled us out of an OCD diagnosis. You will hear from clients, though, that they ruminate about their anxiety, they ruminate about their stress, they're thinking about their shame, they got in an argument with their wife last night and they can't stop thinking about it, and that's why they fill in the blank. It feels very OCD-like, and most of your clients will tell you it's no longer pleasurable. Is that, yep. And so, unfortunately, though, you can't use the diagnosis. And sorry, I did the more popular folks, in case anybody is a I like to read articles kind of person, those are the names Quadland and Coleman. Eli Coleman is one of the originators of sexual compulsivity. If you look up any of their articles, you'll get their good definition of what this is. Hypersexual disorder. So this, as I mentioned, was the proposed diagnosis for the DSM-5. It was not successful, as you guys all probably know. What hypersexual disorder did, originally, they were actually trying to figure out what would be considered hypersexual. So when you read some of the early research from Kafka, he took the Kinsey study, and there's a new study out as well. It's one of the first sites in my resources of what would be like normative sexual behaviors. And so he decided he was going to figure out total sexual outlets for the week, TSOs, and anything over a certain number of TSOs was going to be considered hypersexual. Well, come on now, right? So he got rid of that and ended up with this, because what he found was actually more important was the mental state behind the sexual behavior. He kept the name hypersexual, which again is a little confusing because you're expecting your clients to be acting out all over the place. It's done in order to change a mood state. It's done to relieve stress. There's attempts to control the behavior, to stop the behavior, a disregard of risk to self or others. And this is when we're going to talk about when we get into intake, a lot of clients don't actually realize the risk to self or others that they're putting themselves in, and you may have to educate them on that. Not to do another diagnosis. They were very careful when they did the hypersexual field trials to make sure that they didn't have anybody in the field trial who was drug or alcoholic, ADHD, or bipolar, because they wanted to make sure that they had as clean of a sample as humanly possible. As you can imagine, that was incredibly difficult. But they wouldn't diagnose somebody as hypersexual if they were engaging in any of these other, drugs, alcohol, or if they had a different diagnosis that could possibly be the cause. The thing about hypersexual disorder, it's limited to what they're calling normative sexual behaviors. Who decides what's normative and what's non-normative? I don't know. Yes, some committee. The DSM committee, because we got paraphilias, right? So it is limited to these behaviors. Any of these behaviors are considered to be normative behavior: masturbation, pornography, telephone sex, strip clubs, sexual behavior with consenting adults. That does include paying for sex. Say again? Normative is normal? No, yes. Okay, sorry. Yes. Normative is what folks somewhere decided most people engage in. If you meet these criteria. So if you're masturbating to the point that you have an excessive time, planning or engaging in, if you're doing it in response to mood, right. So what they did decide, though, is that you could meet hypersexual criteria and paraphilic criteria at the same time. So if you have somebody who's watching voyeuristic pornography, which is also out there, right, they might meet criteria because they're engaging in excessive use of pornography in response to mood. They may also meet criteria for voyeuristic disorder. So they decided you can do both. All right. Any questions so far? I'm zipping. All right. Out of control sexual behavior. This is Douglas Braun Harvey. He wrote a fantastic workbook, which I also cited for you in your references, for use with chemical dependency clients. He does not believe that there's a diagnostic. This isn't a diagnostic term. These are for folks who are engaging in sexual behaviors that are causing harm to themselves or others, okay? Which sounds a lot like everything we've already been talking about, right? You see the theme. We are all kind of saying the same words. We just like to put different labels on them. Paraphilic disorders. So a paraphilic disorder is a non-normative sexual behavior. Again, there's that word normative. Here's why I want to spend some time on this. Paraphilic disorders can have a lot of consequences, legally, clinically, that you need to be very, very careful around diagnosing paraphilic disorders, okay? We're not saying that these behaviors are bad behaviors. They must cause distress or impairment to the client, okay? Or they must have created victims, all right? So the reason why this is important is sexual sadism and sexual masochism are considered paraphilic disorders. I don't want anybody to raise their hand, but I do want you all to think about BDSM type things that you've heard about, or that you maybe have a friend that you know who's engaged in some, right? That wouldn't be considered sexual sadism or sexual sadism disorder, right? It becomes a moral argument sometimes if somebody's engaging in a behavior that you may not agree with. Cross-dressing, right? Men wearing women's underwear. That may not actually be a disorder, okay? If it's not causing distress or impairment, it's not a paraphilia. Be very careful about moral judgments, particularly when it comes to the field of sex, okay? It can be fantasies, urges, or behaviors. So some folks will see the diagnosis of pedophilic disorder and immediately jump to contact offender, right? That is not true. Don't make that leap in your brain, okay? Because it can be fantasies, right, as well. Is there a question? Pedophilic disorder.
Oh, okay, so you said there's no contact.
No. Fantasies, urges, or behaviors. So if I'm disturbed by the fact that I think every day about feet, and I'm turned on by feet, but I haven't actually gone out to try to find feet. Ooh, look at all the feet, right? Look, there's feet, right? I can still be given a paraphilic disorder because I'm disturbed by my own fantasies. Does that make sense? Say again?
You're not disturbed by it, it's okay.
If you're not disturbed by it, it's okay unless I create a victim. So if I were to come over to this nice woman here and start playing with her feet, you might want to give me a paraphilic diagnosis. You may also want to do a lot of other things. If she, let's assume she didn't consent. Yeah, we're going to assume. Oh. So, yes. So I want to go through some of them kind of quickly. So pedophilic disorder is an attraction to a prepubescent child. So do not give pedophilic disorder if somebody is watching child pornography, but the pornography is of teenagers. That's not pedophilic disorder. An attraction to teenagers is normative for an adult heterosexual male. So that's also a fun question. If you have a male, yes, gentlemen, take a deep breath. It is. If you have a client who comes into your office and says, oh no, I'm not attracted to teenagers at all, you're going to have to call bullshit, right? You just are. And the way I explain it to folks, and frequently have to explain this to judges and attorneys, Does everybody remember when the twins were, who are the twins? The Olsons, when they were about to turn 18? This country had a countdown clock, right? When Britney Spears was about to turn 18, Howard Stern was announcing it on the radio. Why? Because she's going to be legal. So every man who on, I don't know what her birthday is, but May 19th, who was like, can't be attracted, ta-da, I can be attracted today. It's there, but you have the recognition that I don't want to act on it. Okay, but that's not pedophilic disorder. Peripubescence is also not pedophilic disorder. So a peripubescent is a child who's in that developing stage. They're starting to get secondary sex characteristics. That would be hebephilic disorder. But don't give pedophilic disorder if they're not attracted to prepubescent, so no secondary sex characteristics. Again, you can give it if they don't have victims. If it's fantasies, you can give it for child pornography. It's the only one, so one of the things that they did in the DSM, which I do actually like that they did this, for every other paraphilic disorder, they gave them remission criteria. So just like substance use disorders, paraphilic disorders can now go into remission. Here's a fun fact. How long does it take to go into remission, full remission for substance use? I'm here in a year, I'm here in 2. Full sustained remission in the DSM. 12 months. 12 months. And you can have craving, right? So you can be in remission, still having cravings to use, right? You can't for paraphilic disorders. If you have a craving, you're technically still paraphilic. And the remission is 5. 5 years. So let's get on the soapbox here for a second and talk about how the legal system got involved in our mental health diagnoses, right? But it's 5 years. But it is nice. It's there, right? It does help folks. It doesn't follow them around as often. And there's also in controlled environment criteria as well. So if you have somebody who's in treatment who had exposed themselves prior to treatment but hasn't since they've been with you, you can give the in a controlled environment criteria, which is nice. It helps the next person who gets them know kind of what's been cooking. Pedophilia is the only one that they didn't give a remission criteria for. So don't put pedophilic disorder in remission. It's not in there. That is an argument. I don't know if they're going to fix it or not. Exhibitionism is sexual gratification, exposing oneself to an unsuspecting person, right? And so this is fun when you're interviewing clients who are doing webcam, right? The other person on the other side of the webcam may or may not actually be consenting, right? So chat roulette, right? A lot of clients will expose themselves through chat roulette. They're an exhibitionist or have exhibitionistic disorder. Masturbating to a consenting person in, Europe, that would not be exhibitionistic disorder, okay? Voyeurism is gratification at seeing somebody, again, unconsenting, in a state of dress or in a sexual activity. That's also very important as well. For exhibitionism, you also have to note if they're attracted to, if they're exposing to children or adults or both. For pedophilia, you have to note if it's exclusive or non-exclusive, meaning are they only attracted to children, or are they attracted to children and adults, and are they attracted to boys, girls, or both. Worse outcomes for clients who are attracted to boys, and obviously worse outcomes for clients who are exclusively pedophilic. I have to tell you, in 15 years, I've seen 2 clients who are probably exclusively pedophilic. It's rare, at least in my universe. Sexual sadism is sexual gratification at the idea of harming others. This is another category that you can give if there is a victim involved. You can give a sexual sadism diagnosis. Oh, I'm sorry. I should read my own slides before I move on, right? For voyeurism, you can only give it if it's an 18 or older person. As we all know, adolescent boys sometimes do things that are not brilliant. It's kind of part of their life. And so you do find adolescent boys frequently peeping in on their neighbors or trying to catch their sister coming out of the bathroom. Don't give them voyeuristic disorder, all right? They will hopefully grow out of it. I'm hoping. Sexual masochism is sexual gratification at the idea of being harmed. So sadism is doing the harm, masochism is being harmed. You have to clarify if they're into asphyxiation with masochism as well. Again, you're increasing the risk. When you're doing diagnostic criteria, you're kind of looking at risk levels. Frauderism is incredibly common. Yes, frauderism is touching people and pretending as if it's an accident. Concerts, subways, buses, it's happening, right? It's very common. Frauderism also co-occurs with voyeurism and exhibitionism frequently. Bestiality is not a specific paraphilia in the DSM. It would be another specified paraphilic disorder, but it's common. Bestiality is engaging in or being aroused by animals, okay? Not to be confused with zoophilia. Folks who are zoophiles do not like the label of bestiality. They actually do believe that they are in love with animals, and they go even further to feeling like they are animals.
Bestiality is what you say is common. So what percentage of people would you say engage in this?
Percentage normatively, or percentage of, like, for clients who have sexual disorders, you're going to find a lot of bestiality. In the general population, paraphilias are anywhere from 3 to 6%.
But they're on the high end of that.
Yeah, bestiality is, yeah. Particularly, so if you have somebody who's engaging in bestiality or who's engaging in pedophilic behaviors, right, those two co-occur a lot because it's about the vulnerability factor. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. Just saying
Yes.
the animal's not consenting.
The animal is not consenting, right? And so it's about the that's what I'm saying. For zoophiles, they really do believe that they are in love with, and that there's.
So they're denying harm. It's kind of like a pedophile denying I'm hurting a child.
Isn't a pedophile
Yeah.
who believe they're in love with?
No.
No? Oh.
No. Pedophilic disorder is an attraction too. And again, particularly if they're non-exclusive, which is most folks with pedophilic disorder, they're very disturbed by their attraction, and they want to try to change their attraction. And there's a lot of shame. Remember, because with paraphilic disorders, it can be distress, right? It doesn't have to have a victim. It can be distress. And you will have clients come to you. Folks are more fearful to come and talk about their attraction to minors, but you will get them. And when you get them before they do anything, whether it's viewing child pornography or anything, please talk to them and help them, and don't judge, because they really are coming to you because they feel intense shame and they want to. We also do know that you can regress back to the norm for some clients in terms of a sexual template. You had a question.
How frequently do you have bestiality without a co-occurring other sexual addiction or other sexual behavior? So you just get them as someone has, like you said, pre-action, just
Yep.
fantasy thoughts without any of the other addictions or other disturbing sexual behaviors?
So bestiality without another paraphilia, or bestiality without having acted on an animal? Or two? Yeah.
Or even just without any other sexual disturbing behavior? Is it usually independent of it, usually co-occurring?
I can't think of anybody I've had that was just bestiality. Yeah. Frequently co-occurring. Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, all this is kind of new to me because, like, I'm old. But we didn't study this. But it seems to me, first of all, I think a lot of it would be culturally based, but also subjective. Like if somebody's feeling distressed, well, how do you measure that? I thought for a disorder there had to be a black and white was causing problems, and I'm thinking, gee, I mean, all these diagnoses. What is the consequence of, say, a young person being diagnosed with one of these things for the rest of their lives?
And that's why I'm saying be very careful when you're giving these diagnoses. Be very careful. You want to be sure. Sometimes it's something they may have had a thought, and they're freaked out by that thought.
And then they can become like there's some sort of
Right.
sexual deviant.
Right.
So much of this, it sounds to me, is so subjective. Just thinking about maybe something one day.
Right.
And then people change, especially adolescents. I'm thinking,
Yes.
is anybody normal now? Our thoughts in our head can give us a diagnosis.
Well, I think most of our diagnoses in the DSM are our thoughts in our head. Depression is thoughts in your head that cause distress. And then lack of energy, anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, social phobia. We don't call it social phobia anymore. Sorry. I don't know what we call it. But so the other piece is, again, I don't want you to be the moral police. This is intense and recurrent. So these go on for over 6 months, right? So it isn't, now, you will get clients who come to you who went, oh my goodness, I had this thought last night. What is wrong with me, right? But it's like any other diagnosis. It has to occur over a period of time. And that's also what's nice about the new remission criteria is if you have a 19-year-old who gets caught on college campus because he's been exposing himself to his co-eds, you know, for the last however many years, he can go into remission for that. Well, one instance of bad behavior, we're not going to, be very careful. There's no streakers anymore? No. Right. So they're not sexually aroused by it, though. Well, you ask. No, you ask, right? So a lot of... right? So the thing that you all know from having worked in substance use and in mental health is you have to be willing to ask questions. And the more questions you're willing to ask, the more questions they're willing to answer. And you would be very surprised. You start to ask a client, how many times a day do you masturbate? What do you masturbate to? When you search for pornography, what search terms do you use? Doors open, right? And they also feel less judged and less shamed because you're willing to have a conversation with them about it. But if somebody streaks on a college campus on a dare, they're likely not sexually aroused by it. But if they are, then you have a conversation. But you just have to ask. But I wouldn't give them one instance of bad behavior a paraphilic disorder. That's why I'm kind of harping on the paraphilias, because I see it happen time and time again, and it does. It follows people forever. Yeah, I saw it, yeah.
How do you, I mean, is there somewhere where it tells you how many times a day is not normal compared to normal?
No.
Or it's just whether it causes them some sort of distress?
Is it causing distress? Go back to your substance use criteria. Is it causing them distress? Are they not engaging in important social, occupational, or recreational functioning? Is it causing their partner distress? Right? Now, don't give somebody sex addiction or hypersexual disorder because their spouse drags them into treatment and says, fix this, right? It may be that they're not compatible. It may be that a sexual health conversation has to occur between the couple, right? But it's all about good clinical interviewing. What's the number of beers a night that somebody can have before they're an alcoholic?
Well,
is there a number?
Well, they say they have to make sure drinking a case a night for every night for a year, 10 years, you kind of, probably have been involved in some problems.
Right. And so, but you need to look at the totality is what I'm saying. So in your brain, if somebody comes to you and says, I've been doing this for whatever it is, I go to a strip club every night on my way home from work, right? Substitute if they were going home to a bar every night on the way home from work, right? What would you think about that? So start to use the knowledge that you already have. This isn't actually as tricky, right? The hardest part is learning how to say sex words and getting comfortable with them, right? It really is. And again, the more you ask and the more you're comfortable and the more you take a non-judgmental stance, they're going to tell you things. And they're going to be relieved. Yes?
Cultural differences. I mean, would you call like a polygamist is a pathology? Because according to our normal behavior in our culture, that's kind of the easiest behavior.
Right.
So where do you draw the line?
So what say you guys, after we just had this discussion on paraphilic disorder, somebody who's engaging in polygamy, is that a paraphilic disorder? I'm hearing lots of no's because nobody's in distress and everybody's consenting. It's a legal issue. Right. Right. So you want to look for distress. You want to look for impairment, right? Yes?
How would you suggest the best way to learn the language, not the clinical language? So like I've heard someone
So this is a fascinating question up here. So what she just asked is, how do you learn the language, right? So there is all sorts of sex lingo out there. You are not going to learn all the language. I do intakes every day that I'm like, can you tell me right? My computer, it hates me. Yeah, don't Google things, by the way. Don't. Just ask your client. If your client uses a word, and it's just, I mean, think about drugs. How often do they come in with a new name of a drug and you're like, what? And you're like, oh, that was pot back in my day. Like, oh, okay, I get that. And it can help the conversation. Don't be afraid to not know things. I mean, think about it. If we had to know everything that was on that internet right now, my brain would explode, right? Just ask. So yeah, just ask. And sometimes friends too.
She wants to know what a pillow princess is. She said that, for example, I don't know
What is pillow princess?
Oh, from what I understand, it's typically in lesbian relationships the person that receives oral sex but chooses not to give it at all.
At all?
Oh, boy, that's
I
good.
missed me. Good. Did I see a? Oh. So the phrase that came up that she didn't know was pillow princess, and she's like, how would I ever learn what that is? It has to do with lesbian sex. Did I see a hand somewhere? Yes.
The Urban Dictionary can help.
The Urban Dictionary, by the way, if you go to the last page of any word in the Urban Dictionary, it's always sexual. So don't let your kids look things up on the Urban Dictionary because they will learn things that later on you're like, oh, shoot. Right? Yes, the Urban Dictionary is very helpful. But yeah, ask friends. Don't ask them too much if you don't want to know the answer. All right. Okay, so let's, fetishism and partialism, non-living objects or non-genital body parts. So this is important. Some folks would like to diagnose every man in the United States who's attracted to boobs with fetishism. That would actually not be a fetish because it is considered part of the sexual organs, I should say, okay? But feet are common, legs are common, shoes would be a fetish. Cigarettes, I've had a lot of clients who have fetishes for cigarettes. Cigarettes and red lipstick, I don't know why those two, yeah. All right, so just because you guys have brought up some good case examples. So if a client comes into your office and he discusses that he enjoys watching his wife having sex with another person and fantasizes about this, what types of questions would you ask in order to decide if there's a paraphilic diagnosis? And what paraphilias are you thinking about?
Is your wife consensual?
Is your wife consensual? Good.
Is this disturbing or interfering with your relationship
Is
with your wife?
it disturbing or interfering with your relationship with your wife or yourself, right? Yeah.
Do you like having sex with your wife, or is it just you watching her have sex?
Right?
I would ask if he's disgusted with his wife.
Is he disgusted with his wife?
What's his problem?
Well, let's assume that let's assume that he's here because he wants you to help him with this issue, right? And so part of his sexual template is watching his wife have sex with another man and fantasizing about it. So he is distressed. Let's assume he's distressed.
It's just a fantasy right now.
Nope.
Oh,
Watching. What diagnosis are we missing? The possibility of voyeurism. Why are we missing voyeurism? Does the other man know?
Oh, the other man.
Right. So there is a paraphilic disorder called Troilerism, where the husband will, and it's men. Sorry guys. They will hide, and the other man is actually unsuspecting, and videotaping. So you would want to rule out a voyeuristic disorder. You would want to rule out consensual activities, things like that. So you do.
I had a client actually that this actually happened. He didn't watch, but he liked her to come home and tell them.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Is that voyeur?
No.
No.
Audio voyeurism, even though it's something that we talk about, because you're not actually visualizing somebody engaging in sexual activity, would not meet technical criteria for voyeuristic disorder. Right. Voyeurism is more about sight, but there is audio voyeurism is also actually is a thing people do like to listen. Okay, a client comes to treatment and discusses that he enjoys looking into the windows of his neighbor's home and then masturbates to what he sees. What types of questions do you want to know? You do. You do need to know something.
What is he looking at?
What is he looking at? I've had a lot of clients who actually were watching families cook dinner and sit around the dinner table, and it was more of a longing for belonging that totally did not intend to rhyme, right? But that was actually it was more of loving feelings that was the eroticized as opposed to watching them engage in any sexual activity. And that is actually also common. So it would not be voyeuristic disorder because they're not looking for folks engaged in sex acts or engaged in dressing. It's still inappropriate. Oh, yes. Oh, yes, 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 yes. Please don't. I'm not saying any of that. Yes. No, no, not appropriate. They could still be arrested. Oh, yes, 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 yes.
Is it any easier to trace because it's more of it's not something that's so set? You can address the longing and the.
So this is a good question, and she's jumping the gun on me a little bit, but I'll address it now. So what she said is it any easier to treat because it's not an eroticized thing. Sex addiction is not about sex. It's about what sex is doing for them or to them. And very frequently, it's belonging, it's nurturing, it's power, it's control, it's a false sense of intimacy. That's what you're going to want to address. You need them to put down the behaviors, right? But you're going to want to address those issues. Those are all needs that we all have, right? We all need to feel in control of our lives. We all need to feel powerful. How we go about getting there is sometimes the issue, right? And so you're going to address those needs. Yeah, so no, it's not easier. Okay. No. The client states that we kind of talked about this, but he states that he views child pornography. What types of questions would you need to ask to clarify?
How old the child is.
Beautiful. Good. And what's our ages? What are we looking for?
Below puberty.
Awesome. Right? So you want to look for prepubescence, peripubescence, or pubescence. Okay? Again, child sexual abuse images are still illegal if it's an adolescent. Don't let your clients pretend like it's not. It's still illegal, but we're talking diagnostically, okay? Yeah, we'll skip that one because you guys get that. Clients view webcams of unsuspecting people for voyeuristic activity. Place cameras in locations where people change. This is very common now for voyeurism. There's shoe cameras, there's cameras in bathrooms, there's cameras all over the place. Using web cameras to expose themselves. Watching nudist sites to view children. So this is one way that folks are getting around the illegal pornography. Nudist sites are legal online. And so in order for them to have their urges met, they'll be viewing nudist sites. So you want to ask about those types of things. Barely legal pornography. Does everybody know what barely legal pornography is? So it's 18 years old. The actors are all 18, but they're dressed to look certain different ages, or they're made up to look certain different ages. You will have a lot of clients who say, yeah, I watch barely legal. You're attracted to minors, and we need to talk about that, right? And it's not just girls in like adolescent schoolgirl outfits, you know, like those types of fantasies. You want to find out what they're actually viewing. Barely legal is one way your clients will try to justify an attraction template that's off. Reading erotica about incest? Yes?
This might not be the appropriate place for this, and
Go.
maybe it can be discussed later, but with the new bathroom rules with the whole transgender thing, I know it's not the transgender person we need to worry about, but this opens a big can of worms and a lot of discussion for people. It opens a door for the voyeurs, for people that are seeking a thrill sexually, for preying on people in bathrooms. And like I said, it may not belong here, but I thought I'd ask.
Yeah.
About it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what were you going to say?
Like, it's been happening for a long time. People
Right.
have been accosted and watched and everything in bathrooms forever.
Yeah. I had a client who put a camera in Target changing rooms. He found a way to get in there, and nobody questioned him. Luckily, his wife caught his phone and was able to, that's how he got into treatment. But I don't think it opens up the door any more than, yeah. Yeah. If somebody wants to, they're gonna find ways. Reading erotica about incest is interesting because not all erotica about incest is about children. You want to ask them the themes that are going on. A lot of times it's adults, adult parent-child relationship, brother-sister relationships, So you want to not jump to they might have a pedophilic disorder if you hear about incest. Even incest pornography is not always children. So again, questions. You guys have to, questions, lots of questions, right? Bestiality pornography is one way that folks get around that. And then just last little fun fact, alcoholism in paraphilias is, folks with paraphilic disorders have a high incident of alcoholism. A lot of times it's due to the shame. Either the shame afterwards or they're trying to curtail their urges ahead of time. I had a client who would go home from work and he would start drinking in the hopes that he would fall asleep and that he wouldn't engage. He was watching pornography that he was not, he had fetish, and he would just try to fall asleep. And so he ended up with an alcohol use disorder on top of a paraphilic disorder that needed to be treated. The paraphilic disorder was the primary. When we worked on that, the alcohol use disorder was easier. Yes. Yep. Yes, sir.
I think in the same area, I had a client a few years ago who went to chat rooms, and it was all, there was nothing visual, but they would role play mostly incest stuff.
Yes, that's a good chat rooms too. When you have clients who say, oh, I go on and chat, ask them what the conversations are about. That's a very good point. They will role play things, and then those who get caught in stings like to tell you that, oh, I thought I was role playing with an adult, and then you go back and read the chat log and it's very clear it wasn't. But yeah, ask them what they're chatting about. That'll help you with diagnoses. All right, just so in summary, as you can see from all of the diagnoses we talked about, sex addiction, hypersexual disorder, this isn't summary for the whole day. Hypersexual disorder, there's a lot of themes, right? So it has to cause distress. It's not about the sexual behavior itself. It's not about our judgment of the sexual behavior, right? It's about what the sexual behavior is doing to them. Is it impairing their social, occupational, or other functioning? Typically, they will engage in these behaviors and they don't want to, or longer than they intended. It must not just be one incident of bad behavior. It's got to be a pattern. And a lot of folks don't like us using the diagnosis of sex addiction because they feel like we're giving people, or hypersexual disorder, we're giving folks who have affairs, a cop-out. Well, I have an addiction, so I'm going to have affairs. No. What happens when somebody comes into you and says, I have a problem? We now want them to actually do work on that problem, right? And so when somebody says, I have a problem and I want help, we're going to ask them to go to 12-step meetings every day. We're going to ask them to go to therapy. We're going to ask them to stop the behaviors. It's not an excuse. So don't be afraid to give somebody a diagnosis thinking they're going to take it home as their get-out-of-jail-free card, because they're not. All right, let's take a 5-minute break. All right, so one of the issues when you're working in this field is what to diagnose folks, right? So you can do paraphilic disorders. You can do paraphilic unspecified if it's one that doesn't fit into the criteria. Some folks are using other disruptive impulse control and conduct disorder. Read the criteria for that very carefully because your client may not fit that criteria. It's really not an impulse control issue. A lot of planning goes into sexual acting out for a lot of our clients, so a lot of times it's not an impulse control issue, but it may fit under more of the conduct disorder types of things. Obsessive compulsive disorder, as I mentioned, you can't give that diagnosis. I do know folks who do. Bipolar disorder, be very careful. You will have clients who act out sexually in a manic phase of bipolar disorder, right? How do you determine if they're bipolar disorder or bipolar disorder and sexually addicted? Any guesses? Right. Right. If the behavior is exclusive to the manic phase, they're bipolar disorder. Now, what you're going to see with sexually addicted folks who have bipolar disorder is their behaviors change from the manic phase to the depressive state. So we have clients when they're depressed, they're going to engage in more solo sex behaviors, more isolative, self-soothing, versus in a manic state, they're going out. So you want to do that differential diagnosis. Personality disorders. I hate personality disorders. I think they are awful. I'm sorry, that's my soapbox. I'm done. No, a lot of personality disorders do involve what? Sexually acting out, gaining attention through dress. And we're seeing more and more clients who just got slapped off with a label of borderline personality disorder. Nobody ever looked at the sexual part of it. Nobody wants to talk about sex in sessions. And with women in particular, more and more of our female clients were diagnosed with borderline personality disorder because the clinician didn't want to actually have a conversation with them about what was actually going on. What we know is that as you work with these clients on the issues of nurturing, love, belonging, what looks like narcissism, what looks like dependent personality, what looks like histrionic and borderline starts to dissipate. So please be very, very mindful not to just slap a personality disorder label on somebody who's acting out sexually. I know that it might fit in there. It may feel right. Be very mindful. This is fun. So there's 2 diagnoses that are in the DSM. Other specified sexual dysfunction and unspecified sexual dysfunction. And these are under the sexual disorders, not the paraphilic disorders. In the DSM, it does not mention anything about hypersexual behavior for these diagnoses. One of them is nymphomania in the ICD-10. So guess what? You might be able to get away with giving the other specified sexual dysfunction or unspecified sexual dysfunction for a hypersexual because the ICD-10 includes it, okay? So if you're looking for creative ways to do diagnosis, because unfortunately with sexual disorders you have to be creative sometimes while being honest and having integrity, that's one thing to do. So check out the ICD-10 for those. All right, we're going to skip that. All right, so drugs and sex. So one of the reasons why I think it's really important for folks who work in the chemical dependency field to understand sexual disorders is that they co-occur frequently. So about 10 to 30% of chemical dependency clients will tell you that they have a co-occurring sexual dysfunction or sexual addiction. Those are the ones who are willing to talk about it or who were asked. So think about the population that we're missing, okay? About 40 to 60% of sexually addicted clients either were chemically dependent or are co-occurring chemically dependent. We see a lot of clients who got sober from drugs or alcohol and the sex addiction took off because they didn't deal with learning how to cope, they didn't deal with learning how to have emotional management. Wherever you go, there you are. You can act out in a drug and alcohol facility very easily, right? And that nice person that you see looking at you across the lawn, you know, you start to feel a little bit good about yourself, you start to self-soothe, your sex addiction starts taking off, okay? I had a client who was addicted to crack cocaine and prostitutes. Nobody ever dealt with his use of prostitutes. He finally gets sober from the crack cocaine. Guess what he does? Continues to act out with prostitutes, but he doesn't want to relapse on his cocaine. So he was actually he had 3 women that he used regularly. He was trying to get them to go to 12-step meetings with him because he thought, well, if I can keep them sober, I'll stay sober. He lasted 5 years with this plan. Yes, that was very creative. But so you'll see them, if you don't work on both, you'll see one or the other start to slide, and then they both go, okay? Alcohol, as we talked about, clients will use alcohol either to numb before or after they engage sexually or to have a little bit of liquid courage, right? When you're at a bar, it's a lot easier to chat up the nice lady that's down the bar from you if you have a little bit of liquid courage. High self-monitors. Does everybody know what self-monitoring? What self-monitors? Impression management. Have you guys heard the phrase impression management? So these are the folks who are constantly watching the room to make sure you guys like me, right? So you all like me right now, and if you don't like me, I'm going to change how I'm behaving in order to try to get you to like me. And I'm constantly looking for what I can do to make everything okay outside here. Alcoholics are high self-monitors because they live in a pressure cooker, right? If you are constantly trying to make somebody else like you, it's difficult. High self-monitors are also likely to engage in sex outside of their committed relationship, okay? Marijuana use, it was less common with sex addiction. It has increased recently, particularly with internet addiction. So about 5% of those who are internet addicted are cannabis addicted, and a significant percentage of the internet addicted folks are sex addicted. Did that all make sense? That was a lot of addicted in one sentence. Cocaine and the use of prostitutes is common. Meth, club drugs, and anonymous sex are common. And poppers are still an issue. If you have a client and you're doing an intake with them and they're using meth or they're using poppers, highly, highly suspect sex addiction. If they're using poppers, there is no other reason to use poppers than for sex. Poppers, amyl nitrate. Everybody know what I'm talking about? No. It was invented to jumpstart hearts, essentially. Right. It has a medical use, but people found a way to use it because, you know, we're smart. And so they found a way. And so that you use it, it intensifies the high at orgasm. Okay. Same with methamphetamine. If you have a client who is gay or a man-seeking man, so he could be heterosexual but a man still seeking man, who's using methamphetamine, also highly suspect problematic sexual behavior use. Okay. Yes.
I wanted to ask, with the diagnostic, you know, either ICD-10 coding or whatnot, I know that for addiction treatment centers, sometimes they use impulse control disorder related to sex or whatnot. So, you know, what do you think about that?
Right. So I'm not a fan. And again, it depends on your client. You really have to work with them. There's a lot of planning that goes involved in sex addiction, and so it's non-impulsive. Now, the impulse control disorder diagnosis itself, I think, actually specifies that you shouldn't, which is why they're using the other disruptive conduct disorder diagnosis. So if you have somebody who has disruptive behaviors, they're angry, they're aggressive, and they're acting out sexually, they might meet criteria for other conduct disorder. Other disruptive impulse control and conduct disorder, that is the longest diagnosis. But impulse control disorder, I'd be really careful with it. Yeah.
So what if there's not planning involved? They just keep going to meetings and leaving people that they end up having sex with?
There's planning.
Okay.
Yeah. You don't just... Oh, the whole, this, it happened to me excuse. Okay. Yes. Yes, a little bit of narcissism. If you feel like it fits, I mean, you guys all have to buy into your own diagnoses, right? And you're the one who has to be comfortable. I would just read the criteria very carefully. So, okay. Oh, I kind of went through a lot of these already. Alcohol and cannabis use together has been shown in the research to increase the incidence of risky sex. And so risky sex are behaviors that could lead to STIs, could lead to you getting injured. Also, one of the new studies, the study, Journal of Sexual Medicine basically redid the Kinsey study. And what they found was that older men who are more frequently smoking cannabis and they're not using protection. And it was something like 50-some% of men who are smoking pot are not using condoms during transactional sex activities, which is scary. And then the next highest, besides the 70 to 79 for women, 40 to 49-year-old women are not using contraceptives. That's scary because, you know, you would think you would understand what's going on. And then alcohol, if you add alcohol and cannabis into the works, it significantly increases the likelihood that they're going to engage in behavior that's not safe. What did you say?
Well, I was thinking probably because they're thinking, like I can't have children anymore, so if I wasn't married, I might not think about the STD part.
Right. Yes.
No, I can't have kids, so you know, whatever.
Yeah. You can still get diseases, and we all know that the highest rates of STIs right now are in nursing homes, right? Yes, they are having sex there, despite everybody wanting to not believe that that's true, including the administrators of nursing homes. It's so fun when you talk to them. They're like, my folks aren't having sex. I'm like, they're right now. Like, just hand out some condoms, and we're going to be okay. Drug and alcoholics have a higher incidence of fearful or preoccupied attachment. When I talk attachment styles, does everybody know what I'm talking about? Okay, so the ECR has attachment styles. We know that sexually addicted folks also have a higher incidence of fearful or preoccupied attachment style. So when you're doing evaluations with your drug and alcoholics, you want to look for attachment styles because that may also help you understand why somebody would engage then sexually. So somebody who doesn't feel securely attached, somebody who maybe I want to be interested in you, but I'm also going to stay over here, right? Once you take away their whoopee of drugs and alcohol, those attachment issues are going to kick up, and they're going to need something to replace it. So those are the folks in treatment that you really want to watch out for. What are they going to do next? Are they going to switch on me? So look out for attachment styles. I thought that this was really interesting. One study, and there's not a lot of study on doctors who have boundary violations, but in a drug and alcohol facility, they studied their physicians who were willing to acknowledge, and they weren't in treatment for boundary violations. 7% of those who were in treatment for drug and alcohol had boundary violations in their history. Okay? And those were the ones who were willing to admit to it. So if we start asking questions, we may actually find higher incidence. Personality disorders, as you guys probably know, are prevalent in drug and alcohol treatment, in drug and alcohol clients. And personality disorders, again, frequently involve the use of inappropriate sexual acting out. Okay, so these are just all the reasons why I'm trying to coerce you into start asking questions. Have I coerced you? Will you start asking questions? All right, good. Adolescents. Does anybody work with adolescents? Yes. Oh, okay. All right. So our adolescents are scaring me, right? So 16%, only 16% of 8 to 12th graders reported that they had never used alcohol, drugs, or sex, okay? 1.5 reported heavy marijuana use and high frequency of sex. So these are teenagers, okay? And this was a normative sample across the United States. It wasn't drug and alcohol facilities. This was kids that they called up on the phone and said, are you willing to answer some questions? First, they asked their parents' permission. Are you willing to answer some questions? 2% reported trading sex for drugs or money. So we have kids who, I think 2% for adolescents is a high incident of prostituting themselves. Again, this was a normative sample. So you want to start asking these questions, okay? Did I hear a question? Nope, I guess not. Okay. We also know that when you work with clients in drug and alcohol on sexual behaviors, it does actually decrease the risk of them engaging in risky sexual behaviors. If you don't talk to them about drugs and alcohol, we noted higher rates of relapse on, if you don't talk to drug addicts about sex, we noted higher rates of relapse on drugs and higher rates of risky sexual behaviors. So start to try to bring some sex education, you know, take a class, get some education yourselves, but try to bring some sex education into your programming, into your own thinking. Drug use does cause sexual desire, some drugs. We don't see a lot of heroin addicts in the sex addiction field. But other than that, drug use does cause a desire for sex. And drug users, particularly stimulant users, believe that that drug will make the sex better. They get sober and have sex and they realize, oh, it wasn't better. But for some reason in the back of their little noggins, they're still craving the stimulant with the sex. And one thing you are going to have to tell to your stimulant users, particularly, again, if they use poppers or meth, we can never give you that high again. Sex will not be like that. You will have to grieve that, okay? You're going to have different sex. You're going to have healthy sex. It's going to be fabulous. Sexual recovery is great. But be careful because your stimulant users, even though cognitively they'll say to you, it actually was good without drugs, they're still craving it, okay? What else about that? Yeah. We talked about gay male men and men seeking men, so that's a subculture. Men seeking men is a subculture. A lot are heterosexual, but who are looking to engage in outside homosexual activities. It does not mean that they're homosexual. They actually are more likely to engage in practices that put them at risk for STIs. Those who are using poppers and methamphetamine were 3 times more likely to contract HIV. Okay? So again, you just want to ask some questions of folks. And when you have somebody that red flags and bells and whistles come off, you either want to do a more thorough intake or refer to somebody who you feel like can do a pretty thorough intake. All right, other common comorbidities with sex addiction, anxiety disorders, mood disorders. We talked about depression. A lot of these clients will come in due to the intense shame they feel and look depressed. When you start to actually have conversations with them, when you start to get them sober, get them to put down their behaviors for a little while, the depression may lift. So don't immediately send to a psychiatrist. You might want to do a medical consult, but sometimes the mood disorders are actually in conjunction with the sexual anxieties. ADHD is actually pretty prevalent with sexual disorders. I don't know why. Rory Reed, if anybody's interested, he does a lot of research in that area. That's a name. I cited him a couple times later. OCD is also common, as you can imagine. This is a very obsessive compulsive way of thinking. You get a lot of guys, particularly again, those high impression management folks who like the order, who like the control, and they may switch to decrease their anxiety, they may switch compulsions on you, okay? Social anxiety, this is one. My favorite population is the 18 to 24-year-old guys. These kids, and I call them kids even though they're grown-ups, so many of them were raised on the internet that their social skills, they almost look Asperger's when they first come in to talk to you. You get them to put away the internet for a little while, which, by the way, it's like wrestling alligators to get them to put away the internet for a little while. And you start to teach them some social skills, and they start to light up, and they actually can make eye contact, and they actually have interpersonal skills. But you may have to teach your 18 to 24-year-olds, and younger, if you're working with a younger population, you may have to teach them interpersonal skills because they didn't get it. They lived behind a screen. PTSD is common. Trauma is very common in this population. My clients at Keystone, I did a records review, and 70% had sexual trauma in their history, or physical trauma, and neglect. So it is very common. Now, I worked in a residential facility, so you don't get to residential without having maybe a myriad of issues. But that is there. Yes, sir?
I do a lot of work with crisis intervention work. And we also know that people who have been through natural disasters and terrorist things are also using sex as a compensatory action. Just like they might self-medicate with alcohol, right. They'll self-medicate with sex.
Yes.
So you could have somebody coming in who is talking about the sex and not thinking about the trauma they've been through.
Right, exactly. And so to be mindful of careers folks have had too, we're also seeing more of our vets because they're not allowed to drink, but they're giving them internet access. And so there's pornography. So they're self-soothing with the pornography while they're actually in combat situations. And so it becomes... But yeah, think about folks' careers. If you have somebody whose career is highly stressful or trauma-based, you might want to look into this. Gambling. Gambling is also on the increase. It's less than drug or alcohol, but gambling is on the increase for sexually addicted folks. Yes, sir.
What would be some examples of the impulse control disorders that you're looking at for comorbidities?
Say again?
For the comorbidities, what are some specific examples of impulse control disorders with sex addiction that you're looking at? Did you put it up there?
Yeah. So clients who have, is shopping still under impulse control? Yes. We see a lot of shopping. Yep. A lot of anger, though. A lot of our clients have very hard time managing and controlling their anger. A lot of aggressive posturing. They don't get physical, but they're going to get in your face, those kinds of impulse issues. And, you know, you teach them some good, healthy coping skills, and that anger is not, you know, the enemy, and they're going to be okay. All right, so things that I want you to think about before we get into how to do an assessment. If you're uncomfortable with any topic, so if you can't ever imagine yourself sitting in a room and asking somebody to describe bestiality, when you're watching animals having sex or you're watching people having sex with animals, what's actually going on in those pictures? If you are like, ooh, don't do the work, right? You don't have to. There are folks who will. Know for yourself what your triggers are going to be. Know for yourself what you are comfortable sitting in a room with and what you're not, right? And it's okay. We all have things that we're like, that is just not something I can talk about, right? Counselor burnout and PTSD, vicarious trauma in this field is high. Be very mindful. If you're an outpatient therapist, find yourself a group of folks who's willing to sit down and talk with you once a week, once a month, and actually process what you're hearing, because you're going to be hearing about trauma, but you're also going to be hearing about your clients causing trauma, right? So folks who have multiple affairs, their partners may be traumatized, right? And that may be hard for you to hear day in and day out. And I think it's okay that these things are hard for us to hear, right? Find out before you go into this, if you're going to start to think about doing any of this, when you think about sexual health, do you have a definition of what sexual health is for you? Okay, and everybody's definition is allowed to be different, but do you have a definition of sexual health? okay? And what falls out of that definition, are you going to impose your beliefs onto your client? So, for example, if you're somebody whose idea of sexual health is healthy sex is only between a married man and his wife, right? Are you going to be able to comfortably work with a man who is identifying as heterosexual but his behavior is homosexual? And are you going to be able to be comfortable sitting in a room with that non-judgmentally? Okay? And are you possibly going to do something to nudge your client in a direction that maybe they weren't going to go were it not for your own biases? Okay? So really start to create for yourself. So my definition of sexual health is it has to be respectful and consensual. Okay? That's mine. You don't have to take it, but that gives you maybe a place to start. All right? It gives you a place to start with your clients. Have a definition. Know what you do and don't. You know, what kind of, you're like, ooh, that's weird. I don't know about that. Because you don't want to put your biases when you're talking about sex on your clients. Everything that you have ever known about sex or done sexually, when you start working in this field, will become suspect. I don't know if any of you all remember reading the DSM when you were like a brand new student and you all like diagnosed yourselves. Yeah, everything you did in college, you're now going to be like, oh my God, right? Breathe. It's okay, right? It'll be okay. But just know that it will. It's very personal sex, and it's not something that we're used to discussing or thinking that much about. And when you're sitting across from somebody in session and they bring up something and you're like, oh God, I did that 50 years ago, right? But just know that it will poke at you and get help around those issues, all right? And have good supervision. My supervisors, when I started, I mean, everything. We could talk about whatever we wanted to. Nothing was off limits. And that, truthfully, is probably why I lasted so long there, you know? Function as part of an interdisciplinary team. Oh, be curious. If you're not the type of person who naturally likes to ask questions and wonder, this may not be the field for you, right? Because you have to ask everything. Well, where did you go? And how did you get there? And what did you pay? And you have to ask, was it protected? Was it not protected? If there's something that as they're talking, you're like, wait, what was that? Tell me that again. You know, you have to be curious because that's the only way you're going to get to the rich details. For somebody just to say to you, I watch pornography. I hear this every day. I watch pornography. Well, what kind of pornography? Regular. I'm like, do you know what I do for a living? There is no regular pornography. No. What search words do you put in there? Because if somebody's only viewing oral sex, well, that's probably going to tell you a little bit something. They have a template there. Maybe there's trauma around there. What is it? But you have to start to be curious. If you're not a naturally curious person, it might not be for you. You might miss really good stuff. You're going to miss really good stuff. Really good stuff. All right. So any questions before I move on to assessment?
What did you say your definition of sexual health was?
My personal definition of sexual health is it needs to be respectful and consensual. And that means respectful to self. Good? Okay. So for assessment, there's a couple assessment tools that you can start to give folks or think about starting to give folks when you first sit down with them. To me, there's nothing better than a good, solid clinical interview. My clinical interviews sometimes take 3 hours because I want everything. I want a jumping off point. You don't have to be OCD like I am. You can do 2 hours. That's fine. So there is, what did you say?
I'm only getting paid for an hour.
Aw. All right. Do 2. So there is the SAST, which is, does anybody know what a CSAT is? So CSAT is a certified sex addiction therapist. It's through ITAP, which is Carnes's certification. They use the SAST. So you can find more about that. It is a good tool, but you can find more about that online. Their website is sexhelp.com. And I do believe that they allow you to have your client take it online, and it will give you, yes? Good. Okay. There's a bunch of questionnaires, and I brought some just for you guys to look at. Dr. Rory Reed, who did the hypersexual field trial, has these online for folks for free. And so it's all of the questionnaires that got used. So there's the hypersexual disorder questionnaire. There's the HIBI-19, which is an inventory. There's a consequences checklist in here as well. which can help you have your client understand what types of consequences they may have had because of their sexual behaviors. They're available on Rory's website, which is, I think, rory.com. I feel like it's that simple. But if you want to take some of these and peruse them, pass them out, I also have them on a jump drive, and if anybody wants to stay and download things off my jump drive. There's 4 in there, just peruse. You need to have a good sexual behavior checklist. And I have a slide somewhere, I guess not, of an example of a sexual behavior checklist. What you want to have is a list of sexual behaviors, potential sexual behaviors. Actually, I have mine. That you hand to your client when they're first doing their intake. Would you snag one of those and pass it back? And they can check off any behavior that might be a problem. This gives you a jumping off point to start to ask them questions, right? So on mine is masturbation, anonymous sex, Craigslist, sex with patients, sex with parishioners, sex using urination, pretty much everything. And you'll have clients who look at this going, people do this? Well, if it doesn't apply to you, don't check it off, right? We have plenty to talk about. So that's also something to start with for yourselves. I use the ECR, which is the experiences in close relationship, for my attachment questionnaire. I have also recently started using the attachment style questionnaire. The ECR is really only good for folks who have relationships. And I mentioned my 18 to 24-year-olds, they couldn't do the ECR, right? Because they didn't have a significant relationship. They can do the attachment style questionnaire. It'll give you the same types of answers. And we'll be able, so you have an idea of what their attachment style is coming into treatment, which is important, right? If you're going to try to create a secure base, you need to know if you're dealing with dismissing or preoccupied, right? Shame inventory. There's a really good shame inventory online because so many of our clients have such intense shame. There's an impulsivity scale online as well. Kristen Neff's self-compassion scale. It's always a good one to give to clients. How much self-love do they currently have? Self-monitoring scale will give you, are they high impression management folks or low impression management folks? Again, that one's available online. The MMPI-2, the PAI, the NEOs, those types of things, unfortunately, there's no template for anybody who's going to be a sex addict because they are such a diverse group of folks that you can give the MMPI for treatment planning, but you're not going to find out, I can't tell you what the profile would be. They're not 2-4s or, for anybody who knows MMPI speak. I use the ABLE assessment for sexual interest. You have to be trained in the ABLE to give it, but if you have any client who you're worried that they may have an interest in minors, or even fetishes as well, and they're not being fully with you on it, find somebody who's trained in giving the ABLE because it can help you understand where their current sexual interest is. The cool thing is if you can test them again in a year, you'll start to see their graphs change. It's very cool. And I use therapeutic polygraph in a lot of instances. Some folks recommend doing it before a disclosure or after a disclosure if you're going to have to sit with a spouse and have your client tell their spouse everything that they've done. It's something to keep in mind, something to start looking for a really good person who knows how to do the polygraph. This is an art. I know it's science. This is an art, and you just have to find somebody that's good. So ask around. Personality factors. So like I said, there's nothing really on the MMPI, but we do know that folks who have lower empathy and higher impression management are higher in infidelity. Extroverts and neurotics are more likely to be promiscuous and engage in risky sex. Introverts are more likely to engage online. And they're also more likely to disclose information that maybe they shouldn't, like personal information. So that could be very dangerous. Higher levels of PD on the MMPI, but it's really tentative and it's not very good. So that's good. All right. I'm going to skip this because I only have 10 minutes. Okay. Clinical intake. When you're doing an intake, you want to do all your standard things. You want to do family history. You want to do substance abuse. You want to ask them about disordered eating, not eating disorders, disordered eating. Are these folks who also soothe with food? Do they eat their emotions? Right? You obviously want to ask about eating disorders, but you don't want to limit it to that. You want to ask about their self-soothing when they're emotional. Gaming. Online gaming and other gaming, you want to ask them, do they have a gaming system? How often do they play games, and what games do they play? What we're finding now with the younger crew is they're doing split screens. So they're playing a video game and they're watching porn, and they're wondering now why they have violent fantasies. Because it got merged, right? So you want to find out about their gaming history. You obviously want to find out about their relationship history. Treatment history, medical history. For medical history, it's really important to find out, again, about any STIs in their history, any urinary tract infections. Legal history is fun. This is where you have to be a little bit savvy. Voyeurism very frequently gets charged as trespassing. So if you have a client who's like, oh, yeah, you know, I have 2 trespassing charges and that's it, you might want to investigate why they have trespassing charges. So you want to kind of know, think about your criminal code and what things could have gotten kicked down to. Exhibitionism and voyeurism are considered nuisance offenses, not to the victims, but to the justice system. And so oftentimes they're swept under the rug. They're made into misdemeanor type situations. You want to ask them about their religion and spirituality, their recovery history. This is important. If you have somebody who has co-occurring drug and alcohol, hopefully they have a sponsor. They understand the steps. That gives them a fantastic foundation for their sexual recovery. Okay? There are 12-step meetings for sex addiction. There's different versions of 12-step meetings. You have to look for them. So there's SA, which is the most conservative and the most strict. So there is no sexuality outside a married man and his wife, so that means no masturbation either. So if you have a client who maybe someday might want to introduce masturbation as part of their healthy sexuality, they maybe start in SA, but they may have to move out and go into SLAA or SAA, which allows folks to kind of create their own sexuality. Okay? If you have a client who's questioning their sexuality, try not to send them to SA. It can be pretty shameful. And I've also found that for some of my young guys, they don't like SA because so you can only have sex when you're married. So they're single and they're going to 12-step meeting, and it's like, okay, so I have to meet somebody, convince them to date me, then convince them to marry me. I'm not gonna have sex for like 5 years, and it gets very like, oh my gosh, you know, I don't know that I can do that. But some folks really need the SA mentality, which is kind of old school AA strict, and some of your clients really need that. If you give them wiggle room and loopholes, they're going to run through those like it's their job. Oh yeah, and sometimes you have to go to whatever meeting's available. There may not, yeah, there may not be a variety. You want to ask about general internet use. Again, are they online? Are they on Facebook? Do they have a possible internet addiction? You also want to ask about history of violence. A lot of clients are domestically violent in interesting ways. They use money to control. Yes?
I would think you'd want to ask if they have a Grindr account or a Tinder
yes.
account, or one of those type of things as well.
Besides, yes. So apps. You definitely want to ask about apps. There's a lot of Snapchat. All of those types of apps can be used for sexual acting out. Well, Tinder and Grindr, they are only for sex, but Snapchat can be used for sexual acting out. One of my clients told me Echo, you know the new Echo thing? He asked for erotica, and don't you know she gave it. And he was kind of messing around, and so he had a relapse because he had the Echo. And so, you know, there's always going to be things that we don't think about. So, yeah, Siri might give you erotica. Don't ask. Nobody asks Siri. Yes, ma'am. It's an Amazon thing. Yeah, it's new, came out. Yeah. So apparently she will give you what you ask for. Is Echo a she? Maybe I. Okay. Because I'm blaming her. But at least I switched from blaming the guys for everything. So that's a nice change, right? When you're doing your sexual history, you need to ask just for drug and alcohol use, every sexual behavior that they check off. When is the first time you engaged in this behavior? When is the last time you engaged in this behavior? What was the frequency at its highest point that you engage in this behavior, okay? You need to get very in detail about it. You need, yep. Oh, sure. Pretty much. Pretty much. You know, I will explain to them why I need to understand these things and why it's important for me to really understand the ebbs and flows if they've had cycles, to understand who they're engaging with. If there's a sexual template, it's only going to help me keep them safe. The things that I don't know about are the things that are going to come and bite me later. You know, if I don't know that your sexual template is for college students, and I, you know, encourage you to go get a teaching job on campus because you're a math professor, you know, I kind of need to know these things. But also I need to know, are you in danger at work? So if you're having affairs with somebody that you work with, right? So that's why the who, what, when, where, and why is really important. Are you engaging in sex at work? Because now you're putting your job in jeopardy. So we need to start to think about the totality of what's going on for them.
So for example, this person I mentioned earlier who is going to meetings, AA meetings, picking up women because he's a man, and going home and having random.
Yeah.
But he needs to go to AA meetings.
Men's only. Men's only.
Okay.
So now he goes to men's only. But that's a perfect example of why we have to ask these questions, right?
Well, this came out of our substance use therapy. I finally came on like, you know, I think there are sex addicts.
Yeah. And so, you know, to switch that up, and so he's also maybe shouldn't be around vulnerable women, depending on what he does for a living. So I always think about, what do they do? Like, are they a therapist? Maybe shouldn't.
I'm also wondering if sometimes there's a sense of relief that there's finally someone they can talk about it to.
Yes.
And they're not being judged.
Yes.
Depending on your behavior, you know, to really talk about it with someone and be able to put it out.
Yes.
And I don't know. At
That's
first,
why you gotta be comfortable with it. Because
right.
Yes.
Right. Based on how we receive it, they could it'd be great to spill it after the first initial residency.
You absolutely, folks kind of come in two categories for me. They're the ones who are like, oh my gosh, somebody's finally asking me these questions and I'm going to answer everything. Or there's the folks who don't think there's anything wrong with it, right? Yeah, I had sex with 3 prostitutes last weekend. Why are you asking? And it's like, well, we can back that one up a smidgen, right? And so sometimes you have to do some education around why that might not be the best way to live your life. But yeah, most folks, if you ask, they may be uncomfortable, particularly men telling women, although sometimes men telling other men, they find that uncomfortable too. You can't win. But they do. You ask and they'll answer. I had a client who was in treatment for opiate use for years, and nobody ever asked him about his sex life. And then he was a doctor, and he gets busted for having sex with a patient. And it turns out if somebody had asked him 15 years ago when he got into treatment, he absolutely would have said, I have affairs with nurses all the time. He would have been 100% honest about it. Just nobody thought to ask the question. So you want to ask about sexual behaviors that aren't even considered problematic. How is your sex life with your wife? Many of our clients have not had sex with their spouses in 10 years. How does that happen? How is there not a conversation around what's going on there, right? So you want to start to ask them, well, okay, what would you like your sexual health to look like? You want to start to ask about things that aren't problematic either. Don't just think deviant, think broad scope. Where did they learn about sex? This can be very, very beneficial to find out. You know, particularly, it used to be, well, I found my dad's Playboy, right? Now we have 10-year-olds who are finding pornography. That is not your father's Playboy at all. It's totally different. But did they have, I have a client right now whose father showed him pornography to teach him about sex. Yes, honestly, when I found, I almost, I had a hard time keeping a non-judgmental stance on that one. Took him to his father took him to his first strip club, showed him pornography when he was 12. That's how he learned about sex. So you want to know, because it all embeds in how you learn about things. Was sex a secret? Did they grow up in a very conservative, fundamental religion where sex was secret, sex was dirty, and so now they're very confused? If I had $1 for every time somebody told me that they were told that Jesus would cry if they masturbated, I can't believe that I would actually have a decent amount of money. But so they get these messages, but then what is a 13-year-old boy to do when he has an urge, right? So to find out, well, did they give you any instruction on what you should do? And I know a lot of Orthodox Jewish cultures actually do talk to them about, you're not supposed to, but you will have urges. And they try to talk them through it. Some don't. But you want to find out what happened there, what's going on. What were their family attitudes about sex? What other fun things? What are their views on their satisfaction? We talked about that. Oh, this is always a fun one that I ask. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that I should have? They will answer it, and they will tell you stuff. And then the other one is there anything you were worried I was going to ask you about? I forget questions, I forget things, and they might have been like, oh, sweet, she's not going to ask me about, the time I exposed myself streaking across the college campus, right? And then they tell you, well, I did have this one incident. Consequences for sexual behaviors you really want to talk with them about. Physical consequences, legal consequences, financial consequences. Did they put their families in jeopardy? They're meeting folks on Craigslist and inviting them into their house. That's a stranger. And this is where your children sleep. Okay? These are the types of things that you start to have to think about when you're working with them through their consequences. Okay?
You do like cost analysis. I do that where it is financial, emotional, it's everything.
Right. Yep. You can have them actually, how much money have you spent in pornography? How much money have you spent on this? In relationships. So, throw in, gifts, things like that too. And all of that will be good for disclosure later if there needs to be a disclosure later. Oh, I knew I had it. This is this is what you guys have on that sheet, if for anybody who saw it. But feel free to cut and paste this out of the PowerPoint and make your own. I don't mind. But that's an example of what you can use for a sexual behavior checklist. This would be an example of how I would ask about masturbation or start asking about masturbation. So where are they is very important. Have they ever masturbated in the car, in public? Have they ever masturbated at work? Have they ever masturbated to the point of injury? That's also important. What are they doing? Are they watching pornography? Are they mindful? Some folks can mindfully masturbate, be present in the moment, which is fantastic. Are they with a partner? Examples of how I ask about pornography. You want to know, we kind of talked about this. What do they watch? How do they access it? Is it on their phone? Is it something that they pay for? Are they still going to bookstores? Bookstores still exist. Yes. Are they watching it at work? Where are they at? Who are they watching? Age, race, gender, ethnicity. And what are they doing, right? So again, oral sex, vaginal sex, what's happening in the pictures. Intercourse, you want to ask, again, who, what, when, where. Is it paid for, paid to? Did you barter? That's always a fun term that some of my physicians like to use. It was an even trade, right? Was it protected or unprotected? Please don't forget to ask if oral sex was protected or unprotected. A lot of folks don't think about that, and a lot of our clients need education around that. Were there drugs and alcohol involved? Also, when you ask them about the first time that they've ever had sexual activity, ask them if drugs or alcohol were involved in that incident as well, because that can help you understand some of their history. How did they find people? Things like that. And I am like out of time. Sorry. You have the slides. You have my number. There's lots of resources at the end. Please don't hesitate to call me. Any last questions before everybody runs away? Yes, ma'am.
When you're mentioning SA in terms of seeking treatment for addiction, do you typically recommend either engaging all sexual behavior or only focusing on healthy sexual behavior?
So I have my clients do a 90-day celibacy, and that's to clear out the system, get their brains settled, because I want to be sure that when they re-engage with sex, and it's not on the 91st, that it's like a free-for-all, which you would not believe how many of them have it like timed. I want to make sure that when they're going to re-engage, it is healthy. A lot of them will say, well, but I want to have sex with my wife. I don't know that you're not going to be using her as an object. And some spouses are like, sweet, I get to be settled and I get to deal with my own internal. So I recommend 90 days. Some clients maybe won't go for it. I still recommend it. I think you can do it for 90 days. And then start to talk about what is and is not healthy for them. Do you want to reintroduce masturbation first? Do you want to teach them about mindful masturbation? Do you want to reintroduce courting their wife, or their partner? How do you start? So it isn't on the 91st day that they can jump in. Everybody needs to have a conversation. So, any other last questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, could you just talk about the importance of when it's a good idea to refer somebody that you're seeing to a specialist?
Yeah. So if you're new to this, right, you may not have the skill set yet, right, to really do intense therapy around this. But you may want to start to be curious about it. So if you have a client that you're working with that as you're doing the clinical intake, you start to ask these questions and realize, oh my, right? You might want to refer them to, and again, sash.net and itap.com are where you'll find folks who are sexual health professionals or CSATs. See if they're willing to work with you so that you guys they can work on the sex, you can work on the drug and alcohol or the mental health, but you're starting to learn about this. So it really, yeah.
How do you deal with the, if you have a male who is internet addicted, porn on the internet, the spouse discovers this, the anger, the resentment, and
right.
continuously repeat it, apologetic, shame-filled,
right.
And the behavior keeps happening.
Right. So the internet would go in that 90 days, needs to stop. What kind of blocks do you have on the internet? What kind of monitoring software does he have on the internet? Stop apologizing because your apologies are meaningless. I don't want to hear that word for a long time, right? They may need to do a therapeutic separation. There's gentle separation agreements so that she can start to heal and start to feel safe in her own home again, and he has a consequence. So all sorts of different things you may need to do.
It's not helped by his sponsor is not addressing the issue either.
So he only has a drug and alcohol sponsor?
No, his SA sponsor.
Really? You may need to nudge him in a different sponsor direction.
The guy that's got supposedly 10, 15 years of dealing with this issue.
Right. Now, does your client agree that the internet pornography is not good?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I might talk to him more about blocking software. What can he do to get to step away from it?
Ultimately, he has control over that.
No. Oh, no. You would have download MobiSip, and you would have the admin.
Oh, I have
or
no,
Safe Eyes.
The context that I'm in, I have no ability to do that at all.
Really? Okay. Yeah, somebody besides him and the wife. Don't let the spouses be the accountability person. That's generally, mom is not, that doesn't work out. MobiSip is blocking software. MobiSip and Safe Eyes are the two that I recommend. Safe Eyes is nice because it'll shut the internet down at a certain time. So if you have a client who, Safe Eyes. So if you have a client who at midnight, it just shuts. Is it? It's not. MobiSip. MobiSip. That one's great for Androids and iPhones. See if he can get somebody to be the admin for him. Have, yes. Yes.
And so some of these other things that you referenced, like in this area, or also like internet connections where we go and find stuff.
SASH will have folks in your local area. ITAP. Yep. IITAP. I don't remember. They're CSATs. Those are CSATs. One of the assessments is on there, but that's where you can find a certified sex addiction therapist, and so you can start networking with those folks. Yep. Hold on 1 second. Sorry, sir, did I?
Yeah, it's a tough issue.
It's a tough, yeah. I would start with the computer and see what he's willing to do to